Thank you. All right, now we can open things up to the forum. Do you have questions for our three panelists about their wisdom that they have gained from their experience? Hi, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, but yes. Marion.
Sorry. So thank you so much for this morning and this afternoon. I was curious if you could comment a little more on thinking about gender norms as well. I was thinking, especially for the two of you in the room, the norms and expectations we have for different genders in our society and how those feed both into violence and violence prevention when we think about, say, suicide prevention in men, certainly gender-based violence in women, and how we, in trying to change those norms, might address violence or vice versa.
Oh, thank you. A good example that I have is at the overdose prevention group that I have about 4 years ago. Been there 7 years. About 4 years ago, I casually asked the director of social programming how the program was going, how the overdose prevention program was doing in the women's unit, because there's a women's unit on site. And she said that there is none. And it shocked me because we're in the midst of an overdose epidemic and we're only addressing one group and completely neglected the whole unit. And I said, why? Why hasn't it? So nobody wants to do it. And so I said, I'll do it. And basically the same information I was providing for the men, all I had to do was shift it for the women. And obviously the information was very, very receptive. One of the things I tell them is, and I did that for about 2 months before I backed out and got one of the lead trainers at our program, a woman, to go in, because there was a point that I had reached where I knew that there was other issues there that I wasn't going to be able to answer. So it was best for me to kind of bow out and pass the baton to the person that could best do it. And it's still ongoing to this day. I think that in jail, in prison, you know, it's easy to push people aside and focus on the whole population, and these fringe groups pretty much get no attention. Whether individuals are locked up in isolation, individuals are about to get released out into the community that are completely unprepared for any kind of job search. Although the enthusiasm is there that all I need is a job, you know, it's amazing how a lot of information is not even shared or provided for all groups there. We have, and I noticed, a low literacy level. The overdose prevention program is a six-week program. Initially, it was all done in English. We had a large group that still had to attend the group, even though they had no clue what the individual was saying. And so I decided to translate a lot of the material, and now we do both groups. And at the end of the 6th week, we have a small graduation where we invite people from all over, different programs that come in, and people from the Department of Public Health. And they do the presentation both in English and Spanish, and the respect that they provide for each other is mutual. So it's pretty good. Working hard to try to get that to the women's unit. So.
And I mean, unless you're Oprah, they're the most marginalized voices in our country are those of Black, Indigenous, and women of color. That we hold very little value across the board. In terms of gender-based gender-based violence and gender roles. I mean, obviously, we have a crisis of young white men happening in America. And I think you can see that throughout Europe and in some places in South America as well. I've thought about this a lot, and one of the things that I think has shifted very rapidly are the ways that cultural change happens in the digital age. That cultural change used to happen more slowly, and it would filter in from the coasts, and you would have some influencers, that you would have media celebrities or whatever that would kind of push some of the agendas to more slowly enact cultural change. In my lifetime, the attitudes around the LGBTQ plus community have changed fundamentally, but it's also happened over the course of a couple decades. We still have miles to go, but overall we're in a positive trajectory of better understanding and inclusion. Enter the age of the internet and social media, and there is no longer a filter of cultural change that happens. That cultural change is happening in real time. Instead of happening slowly, it is happening right now. And we are pushing even the boundaries of language and the language that we use. And we are talking about intersectionality and all of these words that people don't even really understand, and that even within communities that are agents for change, there's even debate about what terms mean, that we don't even have the language around some of the social change that we are in the midst of watching in real time. And I think that part of the crisis of young white men is that they have no skills. There has been no dialogue about what their roles are, what they're supposed to be. That one of the things that I think is really problematic is that like in terms of addressing racial consciousness among particularly young white men, is that the only people really talking about that are the bad people, are the alt-right and the white nationalists, that they're talking about this. And it's often the first time that these people who feel under threat because there's this social change happening that really implicates them, and it really is changing their responsibility and their roles and their challenge to consciousness and what they're required to do. And it's really the alt-right and white nationalist realm is really the first place that most of these people have ever had a conversation about race ever. And it's really the first time that they've ever even been challenged to think about it. I don't have any good solutions currently about that, other than, like we have to do a better job actually having really difficult conversations with even really young children about race and ethnicity and what that means and the responsibilities of being in a dynamic society. But I think I think that there are some underlying shifts that are happening, as well as the perceived access to resources, that as economic disparity grows, that the people who hitherto just assumed they would have access to resources, when they feel like they're not going to have ready access to those resources, or now their resource access is challenged, that very often that the tendency is to look for someone to blame, to other, and to find a reason why they no longer have that access. So hopefully that answered.
I'd like to come in on that and follow up on some of both of the previous speakers' really great points. And to underscore that I think that there's a huge crisis among young men, regardless of color, globally. They see visions of a life. They're told to expect some sort of life, and they're not able to access that. I think economic inequity is at the base of everything. We saying that you can have this sort of life if you live at schools, and yet we don't have the same quality of schools in this country. If you, I live in a wealthy area, and the schools here are fantastic, but if you go down to downtown Boston, they're struggling for resources. So that need for belonging and acceptance is huge. And I think if we're looking at prevention, somebody earlier talked about influencers, then we need to look at the bosses of social media companies, because they talk about the levels of hate and violence that's allowed on social media is remarkable, but there are ways that if they wanted, they could introduce things that would encourage acceptance, a positive communication, that sort of thing. We have the head of Twitter going off and doing these Buddhist retreats and all of that, but we're not seeing much of that Buddhism translated into Twitter. And I think if there's a way that we can engage the bosses of Google, Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms in coming up with constructive solutions, and they themselves becoming influencers in helping to create a less violent world at the moment. We're in a very bad down spiral at the moment.
Thank you. Stephen, question? Oh, all right.
I would like to join with the others in thanking you, all three of you. Both your stories earlier and particularly this segment has been incredibly important in terms of insights. I was struck with all three of you talking about anger. And one of the things, I work a lot with young adolescent black men in inner city Baltimore. And they are very angry. You even said, Heriberto, I have a terrible air. Thank you. You even said that you tell people they got to ditch their anger. Well, you know, that's easier said than done, I think. And they are highly traumatized youth, and they would never admit to that. You know, they've experienced all kinds of violence, but, you know, I'm not traumatized. What? Counseling? Therapy? You saying I'm mentally ill? There's something wrong with me? No. You know, they will resist those kinds of offerings over and over again. They might even think their anger is a good protective thing. And we, like in the domestic violence business, we're all about, you know, we're going to punish we talk about hold them accountable, but that's called punish offenders. Call them offenders. We call them stigmatizing things, perpetrators. And yet we don't offer anything particularly useful to them in terms of their anger. We say, oh, you lost your temper? That's just an excuse. Next, what you really need to learn about is power and control. So can you help us there in terms of how do you say to the young, and white men too, I agree, let's help you, I don't know what, because like I say, they would oftentimes say, my anger's good, it's protective, I gotta be angry. I don't know what kind of words to say.
So, the person that's speaking about it needs to have a very good understanding of what they're saying. When I mentioned earlier about getting rid of the anger, I wanted to say that I went into counseling to understand my anger, because I didn't have anger, I had rage. And I had to understand, and I was told by a close friend of mine, he said, you know, you've done everything to change your life around, but you can still go to jail for that anger. And I never looked at it from that perspective. And so that really changed my outlook. And I went and took some counseling to the point that it really, really helped to identify it, and not just to identify it, but because once you can identify it, then you can do something about it, right? But once you understand it and identify it, so then it was coming up with a game plan on how to address it. And that's what I was taught. So when I'm talking to individuals, and by the way, anger, very good skill, survival skill for when you're out in the streets. No doubt about it. That's it. That's the number one. And it's also a primary emotion. So if you're afraid or sad, you're gonna show anger. So I say, because I share a lot about myself and what I've done, and usually there are individuals that know of me or have heard of me through somebody else. And usually the discussion also goes to some of the stuff from my past. And so the transition is pretty obvious. So when I say that, I mean like get individuals that really know, that can share that experience and have worked in that specific topic. Because if they haven't, it's not going to happen. Same thing with communication. My first son, knowing I was going to be a father for the first time, was what really changed my whole outlook on what I needed to do. And even then, I didn't know what it was to be a father. I didn't go to parenting class. I went to fatherhood groups because I needed to understand my role as a male partner in the parenting aspect, what the expectation was of me. So, you know, these are things that I share with the guys that give me their time so I can share stuff with them.
And I think too, like, they've got good reason to be angry. So, like, acknowledging that is, I think, an integral part of that, as well as anger is like the things that you do to survive the trauma in which you live. Like looking through that scope, like you're doing what you have to do to stay alive. You know, that changes the dynamic a little bit, but we tend to allow big emotions for our men. They're allowed to be angry. And in terms of like physicality, they're allowed to play sports. They're allowed to be physical in terms of like sports, and they're allowed to be angry. And that's really the extent of the emotional spectrum that we really allow our men. That there's all of this talk about, you know, growing in sensitivity and empathy and compassion and all of that, but at the same time, we don't really cultivate that or really allow that for the most part in our boys and our men. The Gillette ad that came out really illustrated this. I mean, we also let them be saviors. The Gillette ad, which had a lot of blowback. I had one of my daughters, my 14-year-old daughter, watch it because I was like, and I didn't say anything. I was like, hey, watch this. Tell me what you think about it. And I hadn't shared with her my feelings about it. And she goes, it's kind of gross. And I was like, well, why do you think that? Why do you think this Gillette ad's kind of gross? She goes, it's really kind of white knighty. I was like, I know. I was like, good, I'm glad you said that, because now I can like totally gripe about this stupid ad. Then there was a lot of blowback that it's like, oh, this is, you know, but every male in there except for the black father combing his daughter's hair, every other dude in that entire ad was saving someone. That is another way that we allow our men to show emotion, by being salvific. rather than like, oh, you're crying on the football field. Wow, that must have hurt. Like, it's really brave to cry. Wow, you need help and you've asked for help. That's the bravest thing you can do. Like, that's not like, we're not even remotely there yet, because we're still all about the white knights of our men, right? But I think in terms of, and then parenting to me is like 99% marketing. And so this idea of like, I need you to choose to be on board with this thing that I know is what you need to do, because I have all of my brain and you don't. And I know what's going to happen if you don't eat now at 6 o'clock, and I don't want to go there. Some of what we need to do is be better at marketing. We need to borrow again from popular culture and be better marketers, that we can be neighborhood warrior training or whatever it is, like whatever, frame it so that it sounds like a net positive thing that they resonate with, that is addressing some of those underlying assumptions that they have, and market it better so that the people who actually need those resources will in fact avail themselves of those. Make it sexy, make it cool, make it hip, put it on Snapchat, whatever, wherever people actually are, and market it better. And then also, it's time for us to understand that emotional well-being and building skills and tool sets in terms of emotional well-being and health and resiliency are an essential part of learning, and that if we do not begin to incorporate that into schools, that we are doomed. Like that is part of training and upbringing our young people for dynamic adulthood in the modern world. And I think that is something that absolutely has to happen, and that we need more conversations about that.
I want to come in and also just underscore again what the others have said. I think one of the problems is that what's becoming clear from what everyone's saying is that we need to support young men more. I don't think they're supported. And I think that we're expecting them to be brave and et cetera, and to go into a world that essentially disrespects them. Recently, we had 2 young men killed in school shootings because there's some dumb idea that's given in school shooting drills that you've got to fight somebody with a gun. I don't know who came up with that idea, but they need to go to jail for that. They've got the bodies of those 2 young boys on that. That needs to stop. Even this concept among rape survivors, where people say, well, did you fight? When after I was raped, one of the cops said to me, he said, it's a real problem that you didn't fight. So I said, what do you mean? He said, because the judge could say if you didn't fight, it was consent. So I said, well, if any judge says that to me, I will climb out of the witness box or the dock and I will start screaming the place down, because by not fighting, I saved my life. But in the restorative justice programs that I work in prisons in this country, one of the things that we find with the men who are, some are young and others are not all young, is that they don't know how to speak about emotion. So we have a very big board up that's got 50 different emotions. And when they're talking about things, we start teaching them to identify an emotion, and they struggle. They really struggle to identify emotions. But the more they continue doing that, we start seeing breakthroughs, because they're able to start figuring out, oh, this is how I feel. This is how I can put words to it. And a lot of that comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa, where you would have torturers as an example, and those that they tortured confronting each other in front of the commissioners, but also in a safe space. And they'd also been counseled to do that. And that gave healing to both parties. And they were able to see each other as people. And I think that's what very often happens. Where we label people as perpetrators or as victims, we stop seeing them as people. I've got really strong views on this whole victim thing, which I've heard some people mention today. But the other thing is, one of the things that I do is I also counsel rapists. And when I was first approached by a rapist many years ago who contacted me and said, I've raped and I want to stop doing it, and would you consider helping me? My arms felt peculiar. I don't know why my arms felt strange. And I sort of paused and I said, yeah, okay, I will. Because I thought if I didn't speak to him, if I didn't communicate with him, if I didn't respect him, then I might be putting the next person in danger. And I think what's powerful about that is that these people who've raped or have harmed women or children, where a woman like me who's outspoken about sexual violence, if she's able to show them respect, to listen to them, I think that has an impact with them. So I think there need to be ways in which we help those who are harmed and those who harm come together and able to see and acknowledge each other's people and acknowledge the harm that happens, because what anger does is it harms yourself. It harms yourself first, and then you go out and you harm other people. And then I think in terms of working with people who've either experienced harm or who harm, the most powerful people to deal with them, as listening to the person from Baltimore, I think the most powerful people to deal with them are people who've experienced the same thing. So I know that I covered a lot of violent conflict and wars as a journalist, and none of us as journalists would go to psychologists for counseling, because we'd sit there, and for the psychologist it was like hearing endless stories. So we started debriefing each other, because people wouldn't get shocked by the things that we would say. So I think that's something that's really important, and I think my two co-panelists here, I think they epitomize it in the power of someone who's been through the experience, being able to understand it and being able to express it. And, yeah, we don't get everything right the whole time, but then nobody does. So I think those are the essential things that I'd urge us to think about.
Shannon, I'd be interested to know, how did you get over your personal anger?
Depends how messy my house is. For the first almost 10 years of my motherhood, I actually really struggled with like yelling at my kids, particularly, and even though I recognized like I am doing exactly the same thing, and recognized it as a form of codependency. I recognized that I felt out of control, and that that whenever I felt disempowered or whatever. I also had postpartum depression, I begged God to remove this from me, right? I tried everything. I went to counseling, did all this stuff. It took a diagnosis of PTSD for me to better understand what was happening for me, to really come to an understanding that, wow, I am not acting in proportion to what I feel in terms of my disempowerment. And so it was right at the advent of EDMR, which I did not do. I haven't had health insurance my entire adult life. I live below the poverty threshold. I have my entire adulthood. So access to mental health care was, I had to do it myself. And so I pieced together enough stuff so that I could better learn to identify. I began simply with, I am not responding to what is currently happening. I am not responding in proportion to what is happening. I am not currently under threat. I started with identifying that when it was happening, and then began simply the process of learning how to just breathe in the face of that. And then, and then once I was able to just simply identify what was happening to me, that allowed me some of the space to begin to voice that. And so now, I mean, I have a 3-year-old, so it's chaos all the time. But I am much better able to just be like, hey, dudes, I'm getting really overwhelmed and I really need some space. Or to let my kids know ahead of time, like, I didn't sleep well last night. I feel really agitated. I'm stressed about this thing coming up. I'm giving you forewarning, and that please don't take anything to heart. If I snap at you, please don't take it to heart. Like, and it's okay for you to call me on it. But don't take it to heart. I'm telling you that I'm in an emotionally fragile place and that I'm not good right now. So you might want to like give me some space or whatever. And then the follow up that when, learning how to make meaningful apologies, right? Like, and so when when I'm like, oh wow, I blew it and I just blew up on that person or whatever, to go to them and just be like, I'm sorry. What I did was hurtful and I'm sorry. Will you accept my apology? And I'll try to do better in the future and take the steps. So some of it's just that self-knowledge of identifying it as happening rather than feeling utterly enslaved to my anger.
So a lot of self-talk. Yeah. Okay, Stephen, did you want to have a question?
Again, thanks so much for this, for your talking about your lived experiences. A couple of comments and questions for Shannon and Erberto. Shannon, you were referencing your engagement sometimes with the healthcare system. Were there moments of, and particularly between 15 and 20 years old, where you were engaged in the healthcare system for some reason, but the healthcare provider didn't know about your anger, about your deep-seated anger at that time? What recommendations do you have for physicians, nurse practitioners, nurses, technicians to recognize, Shannon, I'm going to do HALT or whatever, but are there some recommendations that you would make for this workshop to help move the healthcare system along to not only ask the question, but also to be in a position to do something once the answer is given? And I'll tell you my history with a resident staffing a patient with me. The woman is 35. She's got bruises in her face. The x-rays are negative. And the resident is dutifully telling me about the injuries. And then she says, well, we're ready to discharge the patient. I said, well, that sounds, you've done a complete evaluation. What happened? And the resident looked at me and says, I don't want to know. This is 1989. Now, we've come a ways to see that we want to ask questions about, is it safe at home and so forth, but I don't think we're very far along with some of the issues you've been raising, whether it be while you were in the white supremacist world or afterwards, as you just were recently describing. Help us better understand framing some of the ways that healthcare providers can be better in helping you be better and be productive in your family and so forth. And I have a follow-up question with Alberto.
Interestingly, in the sort of liminal time in between being raped and being fully immersed into this like echo chamberic life of white supremacy, so there was like a liminal phase where it was like I was hanging out with these people more, and I was like beginning to indoctrinate myself into the ideology and listen to music and read some of the literature that was out there. My parents multiple times actually took me to like counseling, and I even did like a bit of an inpatient time at like charter or some sort of mental health facility or whatever. Mostly in my family, it was like they wanted to fix me because I was the problem. And when one of the counselors said like, hey, like actually a lot of what she's doing is really rational response to what sounds kind of like crazy in your family. Like they were just like, well, that guy was an idiot. Like we're never going back there. But throughout that time, I was a cutter. I was self-harmed. I literally had like words on my arms. I had like a razor blade carved unlovable on one arm. And I had all of these. I mean, looking back, I was just like, why the fuck did nobody ever ask me, have you been sexually assaulted? Or have you been abused? Or have you, like, nobody. Now, in their defense, I don't know if I would have been able to answer yes in that time, because that was not the story I told myself. You know, like, so I don't even know if I would have been able to say yes to that, but nobody ever asked me that. So I think one of the things is to have the policy of asking if they've got somewhere safe to go, if they feel safe at home. Really coming to an understanding of how trauma manifests and what that looks like, and the symptoms of people that are survivors of trauma and who are still living and still really immersed in unhealed trauma, and some of the warning signs and the way that they interact with people, and even the way that they interact with you. And that, I mean, from a public health perspective, they're much less likely to actually come seek help.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Roberto, you had mentioned about framing services and the stigma of mental health services. At our medical school, we had the offering of tutorial services. Nobody came. But we reframed it and said academic enhancing services. The office was flooded. Help us, what would you want to frame the counseling or the services that helped your behaviors to be healthy, and how can we shape that better? Is mental health, is that as stigmatizing? Should we say something else? Should it be reframed in a way that's much more positive for individuals?
It's a great idea. I've never thought about any other words to utilize. I do know that I try to not use, the actual word of mental health. I usually use, or when I do use it, I remind them that if they look at the word mental health, it means health of the mind. It's your mind along with your body physically. It's just taking care of that health. I don't think I've thought about calling it anything else because it's so common in the vocabulary. But being able to change, look at the words and kind of frame it in a different way has been more effective for them to be receptive to the information.
Okay, I just wanted to actually respond to that question. We ran into the same problems. I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Depression program that I ran in Vietnam, and we had a lot of resistance to it. And so one of the things we did was we reframed it and we repackaged it with microfinance loans, and we called it a life program, and that completely changed the engagement. When we, after we ran the program a couple of rounds, during our days of recruitment, we had a wait list of people who wanted to come in because they knew that, one, it came with a loan potentially, but two, that it's a life program and not a mental health program. So it was much easier to engage people. So, yeah.
Right. Lisa, you have a question.
So first I have just an order of business that just for the future, when you ask a question, please state your name, who you are, because this is all being transcribed and it will help our transcriber. But I had a question for you both.
And you are?
Oh, and I am. I am Lisa Hamilton, I think. So my question to you both, starting with you, Shannon. You work with parallel networks with the de-radicalized jihadist Jesse Morton, who takes a very similar angle as you do in terms of seeing his radicalization as the byproduct of trauma. I know that through parallel networks, the whole intervention method is focused on the idea of giving people in your position new networks to connect to. And this is something that I've heard from both of you in terms of the theme of both sexual assault, white supremacy, drug use, that you are basically in a situation where you're isolated. You had to reconnect to new communities. You couldn't go back to the people that you were with. So my question is, how did the establishment of new networks facilitate your healing, and what are your recommendations around establishing networks?
Some of this requires something from us as a larger community, in terms of something that Charlene sort of hinted at, and I think you did also, Heriberto, that the ideas of like restorative justice and how we stigmatize people and our allowances for allowing people to reintegrate in healthful ways. That is, I think that there's a much broader discussion around that. Part of it is going to involve helping people that are coming from these places to feel worthy of connecting with alternate networks in the first place. And that, I think, is an extraordinary challenge when you're talking about people who are coming from some, fundamental harm that they've endured, and then people who have compounded that with their violence that they have inflicted, because receiving violence is its own trauma, inflicting violence is its own trauma, and it's synergistic. That is another challenge for helping to integrate people into more pro-social networks. It's helping them feel worthy of that connection, helping them really deal with the shame that they feel. And so I think some of what we need to do better is to address shame and address toxic shame, and again, form language around it, form skill sets around it, call it out for what it is. We have a real legacy of not calling things what they are, despite my marketing comment. But like in terms of, again, like just simply, and Charlene said too, in terms of like when you are dealing with people that are sufferers of trauma or victims of trauma, whatever, people who have undergone trauma and are dealing with PTSD and complex PTSD and all of the subsequent things, one of the things that you see is this inability to name your emotions, because you're often relegated to very limited emotional sets. And so some of it really is we need information about our emotional lives, and we need information about like the life cycle of an emotion and what you do with those, and that you don't have to act on. Like some of it is really concrete information that people need before they can ever really healthfully reintegrate. And I think also that there needs to be a broader dynamism of understanding how traumatized brains readily attach to unidimensional ways of living. And it's much like anger in that it's a survival mechanism where traumatized brains tend towards unidimensional living in order to make easy navigating through a complex, often confusing world. And that manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Some are better, some are worse. Identifying maybe some of the more pro-social ways that happens. So, I don't know, people can be sports fanatics. I live in Athens, Georgia. Everything is football. People literally live and die in football. And but that's definitely that, or exercise, or, I don't know, riding your bike, or there's a lot more pro-social ways that we can tap into some of that tendency for unidimensional living, as opposed to violence and addictions and self-harm and other things that sort of is like a halfway house, so it's like, let's get you here first while we continue to address and give you more skills and stuff, and you can focus on some of this stuff to help your brain learn how to negotiate some of this stuff and increase its capacity to feel safe, and then slowly introduce complexity and the skills and tool sets to be able to navigate complexity.
Corinne? Oh, Herberto, I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that. I was real leery when I first was introduced to the substance abuse facility, and it happened to be a counselor that was Latino male that was in recovery, and that sort of had a history that he had shared. And so that gave me a feeling that at least I could be heard, and the more I spoke to him, the more ideas he would put forth, and the more questions I asked him, what do you do to do this and do this and do that, and why haven't you gone back, and just bombarding him with questions, because he was open to it. And so when it was time for me to leave, he told me several things. Go see a self-help group, meet people there, and then go see this individual that I'm going to contact him, and he'll be expecting you there. And so I think that having individuals, again, that kind of reflect that background is helpful, men or women, It's very helpful. Very. Yeah.
Thank you, Corinne. And I think this is probably our last question for this session. Okay, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm asking a question. There's not a good answer, so maybe it will be very short. So I was thinking back to Charlene's business proposition of getting social media companies to embrace mindfulness and humility and acceptance as core values in social media communication. But it makes me think about one of the big foes against so much of this work is the level of excess profit in the insurance industry, the prison complex industry, the gun industry, where they can spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying for policies that are in their financial self-interest. And I'm curious if you guys have ideas, talking so much about the ability of you to self-transform and what we would gain if we get invested in a society that supports that. How do we go against that kind of foe? Do you guys have any insights in making this transformation?
I think that there's a lot of ideas out there. Most of them are initiatives, right? So that they're just being tried out. It's not long term, so there's not a commitment to continually do it. And after that phases out, is done. But I think, seeking those initiatives and finding out which ones are doable or more effective through data would be more than helpful, instead of trying to continue to reinvent the wheel, right? And then the other thing is, on a policy level, ideas are excellent, but all that stuff has to travel down to the front lines. And by the time it gets there, it's been diluted, so that if there's a mechanism to keep that same mentality or idea in place so that once it's out there, it's just as effective, I think that would definitely help in allowing it to be successful. Yeah.
And I think some of the challenge, I do some work with some of the tech companies. I think one of the challenges that faces us is, what is the counter movement? What is the effective counter movement? Because right now there isn't one. Like, don't suck or don't be a Nazi is not like a really good counter movement. And like, we have lots of good programs out there, but there's no cohesiveness. Like, if you look at the civil rights movement in the late 50s and 60s, that there was a very effective counter movement that did not have good funding, that came together cohesively despite some differences in approaches and ideologies and things like that, but came together to create an effective counter movement. And so how do we, because what I think we're really talking about is fighting against hopelessness, right? That like what we really, like that there's billions of dollars invested in creating hopelessness and maintaining hopelessness, because hopeless people are very easily controlled and manipulated, and it's easy to get them to vote against their own best interests and to keep divulging power, right? So what does a counter movement look like that says, that creates hope, like that creates, that hopeful people are powerful people, that we can move mountains because we believe mountains can be moved? How, in the face of so much difficulty, which we're inundated with all of the time, like, how do we create the counter movement that weaponizes hope? Like, what I think that's one of the challenges, and like one of the things that I think anyone trying to enact policy and changes would really benefit from is talking to younger people and finding out where they are and the messages that they're receiving, and because they are on platforms that you are not on, that you probably don't even know about, and what are they seeing there? What are they doing there? What does that look like? What are they interested in? What do you do on TikTok? What even is that? Like, utilizing where people are, particularly because I think young people tend to be those who have the energy to be the change maker force. How do we tap into that? And we do a better job listening to what they're saying and where they are and what their grievances are. And so I don't have a good answer because I don't know what that counter movement looks like, but I think that is what is required.
Roberto, did you want to add anything? You good with that? Okay, I love that phrase, weaponize hope. And I'd love to see that in the presidential election. Hortensia, did you have something? Okay. All right. Terrific. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to our incredible panelists. And sorry Charlene had to go. And we're now on a 5-minute break. And are we going to go straight in? We can come back at 3:40. Okay. 3:40. So come back at 3:40, an 8-minute break. And the next panel will pick up. Thank you.